Seniors, let's get started on today's lecture. We're going to be focusing on 6.2, the transport system. I just wanted to show you this slide because this is how we're going to be breaking down this unit. I'm going to break it into two chunks, so 6.1, 6.2, and 6.4 will be one test, and then we'll do the other test in a chunk of 3 other topics as well, or lessons from topic 6. So let's get started on 6.2. So 6.2 is called the transport system. It's also called the blood system or the circulatory system. So if you see those names, realize we're talking about the same thing. We're going to be focusing on the benefits from the transport system and how it works. So one real-life connection we can talk about with this circulatory system already would be if you've ever heard of cardiac arrest or heart attack. A lot of times people get heart attack confused with cardiac arrest, but they are different. I think this sums it up the best. Cardiac arrest is an electrical problem, where a heart attack is a circulation problem. So you can see up here that the application 3 that we're supposed to learn is the consequences of a blockage or an occlusion of the coronary arteries. So a heart attack is what occurs when your artery is blocked. So you can see here the artery is blocked and the blood cannot flow. Where cardiac arrest occurs when the heart malfunctions and stops beating unexpectedly. So the electrical impulses are not occurring within the heart. What could happen after this is seconds later a person can become unresponsive and not breathing or maybe gasping. And death can occur within a few minutes if the victim does not receive treatment. Usually the treatment would be CPR, but even better is if there is a automated external defibrillator there that can start those electrical pulses back again. For a heart attack, usually symptoms of a heart attack may be immediate and may include intense discomfort in your chest or other areas of the body, shortness of breath, cold sweats, nausea, vomiting, and some other symptoms. Something to realize is that women usually experience slightly different symptoms than men, so usually shortness of breath, nausea and vomiting, and back or jaw pain. The longer the person goes without treatment or a surgery, the damage is going to be extensive because oxygen is not going to get to that portion of the body. So realize there are 2 different things. Cardiac arrest is an electrical problem. A heart attack would be a circular problem. This would be the symbol you would see on a box that would be holding an automated external defibrillator, and it can be used to trigger those electrical impulses in the heart again and get them back in their rhythm and save a person's life. There's usually instructions that go with the box and sometimes even voice instructions. As soon as you open it, it tells you exactly what to do. All right, so in the past, blood was thought to flow away from the heart, carrying vital spirits to the organs. It also was believed that blood pumped through the liver and the heart, so that they were both part of this circulatory system. And now, because of a person named William Harvey, we know that the circulation of the blood in the heart is acting as a pump to keep it pumping through our body. It is not like Galen had this thought in 169 AD. That blood was made in the liver and the heart. William Harvey did some experiments to prove this. So scientists regard theories as uncertain, and new evidence can disprove them. And that's kind of the point of bringing this up, that science can always be disproven. Galen's theory of the circulatory system was finally disproved in 1628 when William Harvey showed, using some multiple experiments with different animals, that blood circulates in the body with the heart acting as a pump. So these are some of the experiments that William Harvey did. So here's one with a fish heart, which is only a 2-chamber heart. So you can see the atrium here and then the ventricle, and blood flows in this direction. And he tied a thread around one end of the fish heart, and that what you saw as a result is over here, that the blood emptied the heart. So what this is showing is the pathway or the direction that blood's going to pump from the atrium to the ventricle in the heart. But if you block it, that pumping can't happen. He also did it with a snake's heart. So here in this picture you can see the snake's heart. and this is a vein, and this would be the artery. And he pinched off one side of the vein, and what you can see is the heart became very pale because no blood was able to get to the heart. And then he did it on the other side, so you can see with the artery where he pinches the artery, and the blood becomes suffocated from excess of blood because the blood can't leave through the artery. So both of these experiments prove blood directional flow, so going into the heart through the vein, and that the heart would normally pump it out to the artery and the rest of the body. He also did an experiment with a dog heart that proved further that blood returns back to the heart so it can then pump it out again. So what he did here was he tied off one end of the artery, and you can see that the artery is tied here, and the arteries are emptied, but the veins are distended because no blood was able, he then cut the artery, and so that meant all the blood left that artery, and you can see the veins are filled because they're not able to let the blood pump through the heart out the artery. So it's proving directionality of the blood. So it goes in through the veins, out the arteries, and the heart acts as a pump. So this would be another experiment done with a human. So you can see the veins are in blue and the arteries are in red. In the first experiment, he's tied with a ligature here around, and it's distended or compressed both the vein and the artery. And you can see here the arm starts to become, the artery becomes full of blood because it's not able to bring the blood down towards the hand. And the vein becomes empty because the blood is not returning up the arm. So the hand actually becomes very cold and pale because no blood can get to it and no pulse down here. Here he only compresses on the vein and leaves the artery open. So you can see the hand becomes very swollen and colorful because it's getting too much blood. And the vein is becoming distended or full because the blood can't get past this point of the ligature, and that's making the hand be very filled with blood, and the pulse is very, very high. And then this side of the ligature, the vein is not filled. So this is simple experiments on human arms that can add a final piece of evidence that the blood acts as a pump, and the veins and arteries are the pathway that the blood will flow because of that pump. So you have to know a little bit about our blood. And if this was our blood in a vial here, and this is a better picture up here, you can see it will divide out if you leave it sitting. But in our blood mixture, there's a couple things. So we have the erythrocytes, which are our red blood cells, and they carry oxygen and carbon dioxide via these red blood cells. Or hemoglobin is another name for red blood cells. And they look like this here with these red platelet shapes. Leukocytes are part of our immune system, or white blood cells. So you can see them over here in this picture with the white. They are part of what's going to help us fight disease or bacteria, viruses and bacteria that enter our body. So WBC is what that stands for. Plasma is going to carry all other components of our blood. So different nutrients that are going through our blood, different antibodies, hormones, things like that. Platelets are clotting of the blood following any damage. So platelets are going to help plug a cut if you get a cut really, really fast so that you don't bleed out. Here are the materials that are transported by the blood. So oxygen, nutrients, hormones, antibodies, heat, carbon dioxide, and urea are all carried by our blood. Okay, so now that you know what blood is, let's talk about its pathway. So there is a separate circulation through the heart versus the lungs. So we need to talk about that because the lungs are a big part of the circulatory system. We're going to focus mostly on the heart part first, and then we'll tie in the lungs at the end. But realize, in order to be calling this blood oxygenated, it had to have come from the lungs first because it picked up the oxygen there, and then it's taking it back into the circulatory system to the rest of our body. Deoxygenated blood is going to be blood that's already traveled all around our body, picking up the carbon dioxide from our activity or as a waste product of cellular respiration from when our cells make energy or ATP, and it's bringing it back to the lungs to get rid of it so we can breathe it out. So the respiratory system, which in the heart, the circulatory system, work very closely together. So here's a picture of the lungs on either side of the heart. Okay. So deoxygenated blood, remember, is going to be considered carrying CO2, so blood from the body, which is going to go to the heart, then into the lungs. Once the blood has received oxygen from the lungs, it's going to go, so the blood from the lungs will go to the heart and then be pumped out to the rest of the body and then start the cycle again. When you look in pictures, you're going to see blood labeled blue, that's usually deoxygenated blood, and red is oxygenated blood, but they are the same color in reality, in real life, as you learned from the Bozeman video. All right, so one thing that's very special about the heart is that the way the muscles work, it creates a system of high pressure so that the blood can be pumped very easily out to the rest of the body. So if you look up here at our understandings, arteries convey blood at high pressure from the ventricles to the tissue of the body. So the ventricles that's why they're bigger down here on the bottom part of the heart, and they can handle a lot of pressure, and they create a lot of pressure to pump the blood back out of the aorta to the rest of the body. And notice they have to pump upward and out. So they need a lot of pressure to contract and push that blood out. Veins collect blood at low pressure from the tissue of the body and return it to the atria of the heart. So veins are usually working at low pressure. They don't need as much force as they return the blood back to the heart. So veins bring blood to the heart at low pressure, and arteries take blood away from the heart at high pressure. That's what you need to remember here. I usually remember A for away, so arteries take blood away, so A for away, and then veins would be the opposite. They're going to bring blood to the heart. So away from the heart, and veins are to the heart. And remember, away needs high pressure to get it to circulate through our body, and then bringing them back to the heart can be at low pressure. Okay. So the flow of blood requires pressure change. So this is the pathway of the blood. So the muscle and elastic fibers assist in maintaining this blood pressure between pump cycles. So what you're going to see here is first the collection of the blood, where the blood is going to enter in through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. The blood's going to go into the right atrium from the inferior or superior vena cava, and then it's going to go into the right ventricle through this tricuspid valve. And at this point, the blood is still deoxygenated. It hasn't picked up oxygen yet. Then it's going to go out this pulmonary valve and out the pulmonary artery to the lungs. The lungs, picture them on either side here. It's going to pick up that blood from the lungs, go through the pulmonary vein. So the pulmonary vein is going to be the only time you actually have a vein that carries oxygen-rich blood. It's the only vein. Usually veins have deoxygenated blood. Then it's going to, and this is the other side, because remember lungs are on either side. So here's pulmonary veins and here's pulmonary veins. And they're going to go in, both of them go into the left atrium. Don't get confused that this is on the right side. Okay, it's going to go back behind the aorta into the left atrium with oxygen through this mitral valve into the left ventricle and then pumped out the aortic valve and the aorta to the rest of the body with oxygen now in it. Okay, so usually deoxygenated blood interacts on this side of the heart, and oxygenated blood would be in this side. Okay. Pumping of the blood, when we talk about pumping, would be the contraction of the atria, the right and left pumps. So the right and left atria are pumping at the same time. So think of it as they contract and then they relax. They contract and then they relax. And they're pumping blood into the ventricles. Then, when the atriums relax, the ventricles then contract, and they push that blood out, whether it's going out the pulmonary artery here or out the aorta. So both the right and left side, right and left atriums are working at the same time to contract, and then they switch, and then the right ventricle. So think of it as pump, 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 pump. Or sometimes they say lub dub, lub dub, lub dub. And what you're actually hearing is the valves closing. So that first sound, lub, would be the tricuspid valve and the mitral valve closing. And then dub would be the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve closing. These valves are there to prevent backflow, so blood doesn't go back the other direction that it's not supposed to go. Okay, so valves and veins in the heart ensure circulation of blood by preventing backflow. So to continue with what I was just saying, opening and closing of valves, as a function of pressure differences, one-way valves prevent backflow of blood. So the atrioventricular valves are also called the AV valves, which are right here between the atrium and ventricle, hence atrioventricular, and right here. Prevent backflow from ventricles into the atria. So on this side it's the tricuspid valve, this side is the mitral valve. So you'll have to remember those. Semilunar valves, or SL valves, prevent backflow of blood from pulmonary arteries into the right ventricle and from the aorta into the left ventricle. So these are right here in the center. So there's the pulmonary artery, and it's making sure it doesn't go back into that right ventricle as it's pumping upward. And then same here with the left ventricle into the aorta. Okay, so the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve prevent backflow and keep the blood going in a circular one direction. These pressure changes in the left atrium and the left ventricle and aorta during the cardiac cycle are what allow for the pumping to occur. So you might hear the term systole and diastole at different times. Systole means contraction, diastole means resting. So here you can see that the atrial is contracting. So that's what systole means. It's pushing the blood down into the ventricle, and that's at rest right now. Then in this next picture, you can see that the atrial is in distal, it's relaxed and it's filling with blood, while the ventricle is in systole, so it's contracting and it's pushing that blood out the aorta. And that's happening on the same side, on the other side as well. They both go, the atrials go at the same time and the ventricles go at the same time. So when the atrium is in systole, the ventricles are in diastole. And this is what creates our heartbeat. So systole means contraction, diastole means relaxation. So here you can see the direction of the heart. So the direction of the beat. Okay, so mid to late diastole, relaxation's occurring and it's filling with blood. And the AV open and the SL are going to close. Because remember, they're opposites. Then the ventricle systole, ventricles are going to contract. The AV are going to close and the SL will open and blood will leave the ventricles and the atria will fill with blood. Then the ventricle distal, so the ventricles are then going to relax. So the ventricles relax and the SL will close and the AV will open and it'll go back to number 1. And this is what creates our heartbeat, is this pressure change between these different valves, from the atrial valves and the AV valves and the SL valves. So beating of the heart is not a conscious process. Thank goodness that you don't have to think about each of these beats that occur every time. So the heartbeat is initiated by a group of specialized muscle cells in the right atrium called the cyonatrial node. So myogenic muscle contraction is defined as this. So certain cells of vertebrate cardiac muscles, the myocytes, are self-excitable, meaning they contract without signal from the nervous system. So here you can see the SA or the SAN node right here in green. The pacemaker myocyte, or cyonatrial node, or SAN, is located on the right atrium, and its impulses are going to spread throughout both atria, and then the atria will contract. The impulse will then spread to the ventricles, So you can see it connects to this orange node, AV node here, which will then cause the ventricles to contract. And it's about a 0.1 second difference. And that's why you're hearing that lub-dub, 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 because they are atriums contract, then the ventricles contract. Then the atriums contract, and the ventricles contract. The scianal node is often called the pacemaker. So if you hear someone having a synthetic pacemaker inside their heart, it's because theirs is no longer keeping their heart at a proper rhythm, and so they have a man-made one put into their heart. So the sinatral node sends an electrical signal that's going to stimulate contraction throughout the heart. First the atriums, then the ventricles. If you ever have to go to the doctor and you get an ECG or an EKG, they mean the same thing, but it's called an electrocardiogram. EKG, I believe, is a German name, but it's the same thing. So it tests the electrical activity of your heart, and so it's going to be testing your SAN, or scianal atrial nerve. So the impulse will travel through your cardiac muscle and produce an electrical current. And you can see in this graph here, voltage is on the y-axis and time is on the x-axis. And so the voltage, this increase here would be when the scianal atrial node, or SA node, contracts. So we also have our heart can release hormones to help speed up our heart when needed to. So exercise, the reason why we exercise is to be in shape. But what that causes is our body to do more cellular respiration, which is going to release more CO2, which means we got to get that out of our body. And it has to travel throughout our body and get to our lungs so we can then breathe it out. So the more CO2 present in the blood when exercising, when it's detected by receptors in your medulla oblongata, it's going to stimulate some different nerves. So the sympathetic nerves from the brain will release epinephrine, or also called adrenaline, to increase your heart rate. So by that increasing of that heart rate, it's going to pump that blood faster through your heart and lungs to get rid of that CO2 so you can breathe it out, but also allow you to breathe in fresh oxygen so that can get to your body as well. The parasympathetic nerves from your brain via the vagus nerve are going to decrease your heart rate when you no longer have as much CO2 in your body. Also, there's hormone stimulation, where if you are ever in a situation where you have to have vigorous physical activity, for example, the fight or flight response. So if you are in a dangerous situation and it's going to give you or release a ton of adrenaline or epinephrine to increase your heart rate so that you can either fight or run as fast as you can. Okay, so how does blood circulate through the body? So we have to focus on these three things. Arteries are vessels that transport blood at high pressure away from the heart. So we've talked about arteries and veins. So veins are vessels that transport blood at low pressure towards the heart. But where is that connection point? Where do those arteries and veins actually connect and exchange what they have? Okay, so the arteries are trying to get oxygen to different parts of your body, and the veins are trying to take away that carbon dioxide and bring it back, and the blood, back to the lungs to get more oxygen. So we have these, what's going to happen is the arteries are going to eventually start to thin out and become smaller branches or smaller vessels called arterioles. So we have the arteries start to become into smaller branches called arterioles, and then the veins are going to start to become into smaller vessels called venules. Okay, so the venules and the arterioles connect between the smallest blood vessels in our body, which are called capillaries. So capillaries are the actual site for gaseous exchange. So this is where oxygen is going to enter and CO2 is going to leave. Okay. So there's these beds of capillaries in all over our body and all of our tissues, and that's where they're connecting these two systems of arteries and veins, or in this case, the smaller systems, venules and arterioles. The capillaries have permeable walls, and they're like one cell thin, and they allow for gas to exchange and other materials very easily across their walls. So here's a picture of a capillary. So capillaries are here in the middle. And here you can see a vein, and here you can see an artery. And then it starts to branch into an arterioles, and the venules branch into venules. Or sorry, the vein branches into venules. And there's gas exchange happening in these beds of capillaries where the oxygen's going in to the cells and the CO2 is leaving the cells. See these tissue cells? These capillaries are wrapped around these yellow tissue cells, and they're allowing gas to go in and out of the cells. So CO2 will go out into the blood, and then it'll go back from the venule into the veins. So it can go back to the heart and the lungs to get oxygen, where the arterioles are bringing from the artery the oxygen into these capillaries, which will then go into the cells, so the cells have oxygen. So the function of the capillary is diffusion of dissolved materials between blood and tissue. It's very low pressure and speed because the cells are so thin, so there's no muscular wall, one cell thick, and no valves. So it's just constant flow. There's no something stopping their backflow. So you need to be able to identify blood vessels as arteries, capillaries, or veins from the structure of their walls. So what you're going to see here is thick walls for arteries. The biggest thing that you're going to notice the difference is the size of the lumen. So notice a vein has a large lumen and a artery has a small lumen. The other big difference is the thickness here around the smooth muscle around the outer portion of the artery is bigger. The small lumen and the thicker muscular tissue or smooth muscle tissue is going to be what allows the arteries to have such high pressure, where a vein doesn't need to be at such high pressure, so the smooth muscle is a bit thinner and the lumen can be loose or larger so that blood can flow easily. Because think of something when it has a lot of small space, it creates a large amount of pressure. So that's why the artery has a small lumen. Veins also maintain one-way flow of blood, so you're going to see valves within veins because they're trying to make sure the blood doesn't fall back to the arteries, where arteries don't. They have no valves except for the one aortic valve that's in the heart. Otherwise, they just have free flow. So the artery here, its function, carry blood away from the heart under very high pressure and high speed, where veins return blood to the heart with less pressure under low pressure and speed. So here's just a more zoomed in picture of it, so you can see the artery has the smaller lumen, thicker, smooth muscle tissue. The vein has a larger lumen and valves inside, as well as thinner muscle tissue. So if you've ever taken your blood pressure, this is something to now maybe you'll understand better, is that you are basically measuring your atrial pressure. So the systolic pressure, a normal range is between 108 and 140. So this is when it's contracting, right? When there's a contraction occurring. And dystolic pressure is pressure it's when it's at its rest, right? So it's pressure in the arteries when heart rests. So during that, systolic would be the contraction of your heartbeat, dystolic would be when it releases. So the normal range when it relaxes is between 60 and 90. So hypertension is so the top number is your systolic pressure and the bottom number is your diastolic pressure. So when someone has high blood pressure, it's usually when they are greater than 140 over 90 because you're out of the normal range for your systolic and dystolic pressure. So, blood flow. So what we've talked about so far is that the blood goes from the heart to the arteries to the arterioles to the capillary beds. Then it goes to the venules, to the veins, and back to the heart. But unfortunately, it's not quite this simple. Why? Because we're leaving the lungs out of the picture. The main function of the heart is delivering oxygen. So we have to include the lungs in this picture. So the blood must be circulated to the lungs to pick up oxygen for the tissue of the body. The heart is a double pump. So the right side does the pulmonary circuit. So it sends blood to the lungs for oxygenation. The left side is the systematic circuit, which is going to send the oxygenated blood to the tissues of the body. So here would be a more proper picture with the lungs on either side of the heart. And you can see that when the deoxygenated blood, in blue here, goes out to the lungs, there's these little sacs called alveoli, and there's these capillaries wrapped around these sacs of cells, and they're allowing gas exchange from your lungs. So they're picking up oxygen, and they're dropping off CO2 into the alveoli, which you will then breathe out. Because remember, your lungs and your heart are two different passageways, so you can then release it out your trachea and breathe out the CO2 that was in your lungs, while the oxygenated blood can now return back to the heart and come in through the pulmonary vein and head back into the left atrium, left ventricle, and out the aorta to the body. So if you wanted to see all the different capillary regions, this is what it's showing here. So the circulatory system's interacting even with our digestive system, which we just talked about. So remember, the digestive system is going to be taking in through capillaries into the blood different nutrients and taking them to the liver for storage for later. So the blood's carrying all these things for us, not just oxygen around our body, but also the nutrients that need to be stored for use from our food digestion. But you can see the capillaries are wrapped around the alveoli in our lungs, and they're also at different midsections between our lower half of our body and up here in our brain. So you can see the human body on the side here, so you can see where they're in place. So to conclude, the blood flow, including our lungs. So the heart is going to send blood through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. Then it's going to bring it back through the pulmonary veins to the heart, to the arteries, to the arterioles, to the capillary beds, the venules, to the veins, and then back to the heart to do the whole process again. So you should try to see if you could answer these. Maybe pause the video so you can try. I pause it right now. And see if you can match these with it. So I'll give you a second to pause. Okay, so if you've paused and you've tried, these are the answers. So number 1 would be B, 2 would be A, 3 would be D, 4 would be E, and 5 would be C. Okay. So that's the transport system. I hope that was helpful. I hope that if you have any questions, you're going to ask. And now you're going to move on to the assignment in Go Formative. And we'll first to watch the Khan Academy video about the blood flow, and then you're going to be labeling and drawing blood flow in Go Formative. Let me know if you have any questions, and save your notes in PDF and put them in ManageBac for this lecture, for the 6.2 lecture, and also in your personal IB Biology folder. Bye, guys.